Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and thank you for joining me. My topic right now is turning crisis into an opportunity. So the thing about a crisis is you could be having a really good day, you could be having a really good financial quarter and nothing going wrong. And then all of a sudden one day it comes like lightning and you sort of have to take for cover. I'll go from my nearest right, and I just want to know perhaps let's start with examples because it's always best from a lived experience. Have you recently or in the past experienced a crisis, and what was your take or strategy to get through it?
I think for starters, when you first start out in finance, you want to wait for all the stars to line up, and you realize after 20 years they never quite line up. And so that's the first hard lesson. But certainly at Illovo, we definitely had a perfect storm around about 2015, 2016, where we had probably one of the worst droughts in sub-Saharan Africa, which just about impacted all our operations. South Africa, Swaziland, Mozambique, Malawi,
Sure.
Even Zambia, where we had very low rainfall. And I was told when I joined the business that everything's irrigated, but if there's no water in the river, then you can't irrigate.
Yeah.
So that sort of theory went out of the window. There was also a time when commodity prices in sugar, we measured by the number 11, crashed from about 30 US cents a pound to around about 10 US cents a pound.
Really?
And then being a big exporter into Europe, earning euros, the euro went from about 130 to 110 to the dollar. And then we also had, whilst we were having a drought, we had massive crops in Brazil, India, Thailand, and they were importing sugar into our operation. So if you ever had a perfect storm where it kind of felt like, why doesn't the stars align? Why do you always have to have perfect storms? That was it.
Oh dear.
It was pretty much quite a dire situation. And, bankers are funny people. Because when you have lots of cash and
they want to talk to
they
you.
all want to talk to you, and they all invite you to dinners and fancy functions, but when you're kind of hitting your overdraft limits and interest rates in Malawi is 30% and Zambia it's 20%, and
Sure.
you everyone's sweating a bit. The bankers, funny enough, don't want to take your call. So it's very, very hard to arrange finance in a situation like that. And unfortunately, I think as businesses, we wait for perfect storms before we actually react, because we think good times will always come, the commodity swing, prices will change, things will come right, and everything will be okay, the drought will be over. But unfortunately, sometimes these things are prolonged. And in our case, it was quite prolonged, and the euro to the dollar is still probably 116. World market prices are still at about 10.5 cents a pound, so it hasn't changed.
Okay.
But our debt in our business over the last 4 years has come down by about 30%.
At least.
So our motto has really been, how can we generate positive cash flow through the cycle, as opposed to just waiting for good times to come, and then we'll fill our boots. So there's kind of 4 things that we did, and I'll probably hand over to my colleagues as well. I'm sure they've been through the same. The one was to effectively develop a cost-conscious culture within the business, and that's about not just taking opportunistic cost out of the business, but just driving a culture where you effectively embed real cost savings in the business, stop doing things, activities that are inefficient, that don't make sense, take it out, headcount freezes, and really just being quite deliberate around driving this cost culture. And we, as finance, drove that process to say that in a world where sugar prices are at all-time lows, what sort of margin is acceptable, and how much of cost do we need to take out in our business to achieve that margin? And we drove that initiative out of finance. The second pillar was around working capital management. So we developed metrics that effectively we could track things like which are relevant to our business, packing materials, fertilizers, herbicides, of course sugar stocks, which weren't moving, and just made sure we kept to very, very stringent targets and got the businesses to keep to those working capital limits, making sure we drove our debtors quite hard, making sure people bought on contract with suppliers so we could take advantage of supplier creditor terms. Because on the debtors front, sort of you kind of demand your money, but people pay you on terms. You need to get the same thing on the supplier front as well. And then capital, we became quite ruthless. So our traditional non-spenders of capex that ask for, as an example, 100 million and spend 50, well, guess what? Next year they got 50. And if they spent 40, then guess what? Next year they got 40. So perennial underspenders of capital, we started to really cut back on that. And then the fourth thing is we changed our dividend policy as a percentage of free cash flow that we generated, which took into account capital, which took into account interest. And if there was nothing left, then we didn't declare a dividend. I went to AGMs where I had people almost throw tomatoes at me because shareholders, because they weren't getting a dividend. But we have been it's quite harmful to the business if you have to borrow to pay a dividend.
Does make sense.
So previously it was just a percentage of headline earnings. So in other words, you'd generally be paying out of non-cash profits a dividend. So that was not a good practice, and we changed that. And over a period of time, with the same set of parameters, the crops recovered a little bit. We now generate significant cash flow with the same level of pricing, with the same level of, in fact, the sugar import, the sugar production in India and Brazil has grown even more, and those ships are all floating around the Indian Ocean looking for a home for sugar, but we still generate positive free cash flow.
Okay.
So I think, unfortunately, we waited for a crisis before we reacted.
Yeah.
But our motto is to generate cash flow through the cycle, and when things are good, fill your boots.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. Hi, Andrew. Thanks for joining me. I don't actually know how Andrew's on this panel today because my favorite drink belongs to your company. And for years, people have been addicted to the fizzy drinks. And regardless of how much the sin tax goes up, we're still buying the bev. Have you experienced any crisis?
Absolutely. I'm flattered to be here, and I'm not sure if that's actually a pat on the back or a slap in the face, because you only get onto a panel if you're a theoretical expert on it, which means that I've been through a couple of crises.
Okay.
That is a problem.
Okay.
So you don't want to go through these things. So I'm not sure if it's a good thing to be here at all. We've definitely had our fair share.
Okay.
What Mohammed was talking about, he's one of our big suppliers, so very much what he was talking about has impacted our business. Over the years, we've had quite a few things. We had a CO2 crisis where there was a shortage of that, and being a carbonated beverage, you actually need carbonation in it, so we had that one. We all had electricity in this country. That was a bit of an issue. We've obviously had the sugar supply item, but most recently, we had, literally in the last sort of 8 months, we had a resin crisis, which is what we use to make our bottles. There was practically none in the country. So that was a small problem. You also need a bottle to put things into.
Right.
Then in the Cape, we had the water crisis, as
Yes.
we all know. So you do need water to make beverages.
Yes.
So that was a real crisis. And then just of late, you're talking about the pressure on our beverage.
Yeah.
And so there is definitely a changing global perception of soft beverages. And then the HPL tax came along, the sugar tax, as it's called. So yeah, I think we've had our fair share of late. But I think just, to call out a crisis is only a crisis if you let it become a crisis.
Okay.
And I think that's very important.
I'm going to want to explore with you just that motto and see how you circumvent a crisis. Dumisani, thank you for joining me again. Your experience is quite vast in different sectors. What kinds of crises have you seen, and how have you gone around the punches?
Okay. Yeah, the most recent one, it's in my current organization. I've joined my organization about 9 months ago. And, coming just 3 months, in fact, 4 months before the end of the financial year, so you don't have much of a background of what has been happening before. And So we prepare our financial statement, and those who work for the state, they know how long it takes. You're given 2 months to prepare your financial statement. You're also given 2 months to be audited. So that's how complex this government is, for those who doesn't know. And one of the crises happened towards the end of the audit cycle, which is literally days before they sign off on the report.
Okay.
And the Auditor General, our biggest friend, they came and said, there's something that is called irregular expenditure.
Irregularity, yes.
If you don't know irregular expenditure, please go and Google it. It's a buzzword in the public sector. And for those who watch 4-8 parliamentary, you will know that if you are going to parliament for it, you are in for a good jolly ride. Then we spend. What happened in this case is that we're over our budget, the money that we have. It's just that we collected more, and since we've collected more, we use more. But we were over about 200 million. Now, what it means, then the AG then picked up that particular piece and says, because you have exceeded your budget, we're going to classify it as irregular. Now, this what makes it a crisis. Because it's a material non-compliance with the legislation, then automatically it forms part of your Section A on your audit report. Okay. And those who are in the public sector, they know that any matter that is on Section A, it means it's going to impact your audit opinion.
Okay.
When it impacts your audit opinion, it's a CFO's nightmare. So you have to prevent it at all costs. So it really tested not only my technical accounting skills, it also tested my legislation knowledge. It tested everything that you can think about, including understanding the history of the organization within that set period of time. And what then happened is that they've audited, there's a couple of statements which we have, which you produce, which is your balance sheet, your income statement, your cash flow. What we provide in the public sector is what we call a statement of comparative budget, which is you compare your budget and your actual. And that's where the AG usually get us.
Okay.
And so what happened is that it shows the difference, and in that difference, it was then classified as irregular expenditure, and the AG immediately wrote the finding. Not only wrote the finding, they quickly wrote the management report and the interim audit.
Okay.
That's how they were excited.
Okay.
And obviously, I had to stop Menko. I was running a meeting with my GMs. I had to stop everything that I do. I had indicated to my team that any audit finding that impacts an audit opinion, the CFO need to know, because then I stop everything. Mm-hmm. But what really happened is that we then identified in the middle of, remember, we are literally a couple of days before they issue a final report, so you don't have time to really deal with the crisis. You have to think on your feet. You have to understand all the implications. You have to understand the legislation. You have to understand the transaction that gave rise to that in order to be able to, one, to write your management comment, establish what happened, possible if you can get away with the finding or get the Auditor General to remove the finding. So what we did, we had found out that an Auditor General had made a mistake.
Oh,
in
really?
our view,
really?
that it was a bone of contention. They have made a mistake that in the classification, in the inclusion of the calculation, they've included impairment, which you all know is a non-cash item because it's merely an accounting entry, and it was a huge amount. They've included depreciation, and mainly about 3 entries, which were really non-cash item. Now, what the debate was, we first provided our response, which they then rejected, but we were very much pushing for it. Eventually what they did, they take it to their technical department. They call it technical department. Technical departments, they consulted with National Treasury, Office of the Accountant General. Office of Accountant General gave them a very clear answer that if it's irregular, it's just irregular.
Oh, wow.
So that was end of our story. But really, when we were looking, and in fact, I've got a very brilliant team, and some of them are sitting there, who really went into the serious depth of really understanding the nature. One of the key things that we did find is that the purpose of Section 54 was to prevent state entities to overly commit the state with more expenses than the budget that they have,
Okay.
which then automatically exclude any non-cash items,
Okay.
which is your depreciation, which is your impairment, and any of those things. But for our responses to be accepted by the Auditor General, it has to be confirmed by the people who have written PFMA, people who have written Treasury Regulation, people who have written the guidelines.
Okay.
Now, for us to be able to get that was the Accountant General himself from the National Treasury or herself has to sign a piece of paper with the government logo to say they agree with our understanding. It was to and from, to the point that at some point in time, I had to leave all my engagement and camp at National Treasury in order to get that particular letter.
Yes, you should.
I mean, at some point, I didn't want to leave until I spoke to the acting accountant general, explained the crisis. He asked to have 30 minutes with his team so that he'll be able to see how they can maneuver. Luckily, the guys, they actually understood our perspective of it, and eventually I walk away with a letter that confirms. What was good is that not only the Auditor General accepted our management comment together with a supporting letter, but they said they're going to circulate that particular letter as a standard guidelines for all the Auditor General offices around the country so that when they audit that particular item, they don't have different interpretations. So there's a number of CFOs and state-owned organizations who actually pull through from the audit finding and they never know where their help came from.
Okay. And now we know. I think that was eloquently put as the CFO's nightmare. I think we should have rather titled the session that way. Just to say to the audience, there are seats on the side, so please continue to take a seat as opposed to stand because we can't have that. So I think the point that we're trying to create is these crises that you experience, they can be turned into opportunity. Mohammed, when you started speaking, you gave us 4 things that you did to change the situation around, so to sort of circumvent in case it would happen again, or in case you were found in a sticky situation where the bank wasn't answering your phone. What do you do as the CFO? How do you then lead your teams once you've implemented these strategies? Do you then create the strategies with the CEO? How have you gone round about it?
So I think when you do these things, you want to make sure it sticks, and you don't do it sort of in a year of crisis, and then sort of things tend to drift back to how they were, and then you're back in a crisis again, and then everyone starts to react. You want to make this sustainable. So one of the things we did was, so we're in 6 countries, was to create some consistency around the language and what we're trying to do.
Okay.
So there are many aspects, but the one thing that we did define was, which all accountants know, is something called free cash flow. But it's absolutely amazing how people don't know what free cash flow is. So as an example, you would get people that will present a budget or a forecast to you that has a fantastic operating profit number, and they're all very happy and proud of the work they've done, but they have negative free cash flow. So in other words, the capital and the interest, and after all the working capital adjustments, they've actually destroyed value. And when you sit in a meeting and you actually say you've destroyed value, and therefore I don't accept your budget, people get a little bit irritated with you because they think they're just driving the top line. So it's about just creating language that's simple and people understand it, so people understand what is free cash flow. So when they come and present a budget to you, it's basically well understood that they need to make sure that they do add value and generating positive free cash flow. So they start to look at all the levers, working capital, they start to look at capital. I've had CEOs come and tell me that they're not happy with their budget, and I say, why? Because the guys have put capital down and I can't afford the capital. So that's the language you want them. You don't want to be the bad guy cutting the capital all the time. So my business can't afford the capital, therefore I'm generating negative cash flow. I got to find levers to generate positive cash flow. Another example is the painful experience you have with minority shareholders. So in all our businesses, we don't own 100%. So It's educating your minority shareholders that your dividend policy is a percentage of free cash flow. It's not on earnings. And trying to educate them that if I have to borrow money to pay you a dividend, you're actually impacting the future sustainability of the business. But to explain that to somebody that's, in Zambia, that's 58 years old, that's put his pension in your company and he's not getting a dividend, it's quite a tough sell.
Yeah.
Because he's angry and he's very upset. He starts to tear your financials on, but how come you getting management fees and, you guys are siphoning money out of the business and we're not getting dividends. So you go through all of those emotions. But I think it's educating your shareholders that this is good for the business. And then having your management team sit at the AGM and listen to ordinary people that are frustrated because of the decisions they've made around the business. And then, it becomes a cycle where when people think about forecasts, when they think about budgets, they start using the language that we're all used to, and it's very simple language.
Yeah.
So it's really about the communication. And then the other bit is CFOs really do need to stand up during crisis times or non-crisis times, especially when it comes to large capital projects. So if you don't have the money, if you're not convinced with the returns of the project, you need to stand up. And whilst there might be an emotion, it might be the CEO, it might be operations, they're quite keen on a big expansion, a greenfield project, or an acquisition. You've got to have the courage of conviction to stand up and say, either we can't afford it, the returns are not good enough, we need to delay it, and we can't do it. And you might be the lone voice, but you've got to take that stance, and you've got to really, really stand up and be bold. And you get shot down, you get, people are very irritated with you because they think, it's the right thing to do. You get this term that we need to invest in the downturn, but people don't worry about where the money is going to come from, how much it's going to cost, what the payback is, and potentially it could sink your business.
Yeah.
So I think there's very simple things you can do. And for me, the most important thing was just creating common language across the business and just sticking to that. And it's about what mechanisms and tools do you need to put in place to drive a wedge through what you've done and make it stick. Because it's very easily, it can get out of control again.
Sure. Andrew, I see you nodding. Have you turned a crisis into an opportunity?
Yeah, I think it's very important that you do use these opportunities to create something. And I think very much what you're saying is all of those things and more. And I think, just what's important to say is that none of us go into these crises as experts.
Yeah.
We only become an expert afterwards,
Once you go
quite
through
honestly. Hindsight's a brilliant thing, and I'll own up to that. None of us knew going into them what we were meant to do. So it's only afterwards that you start realizing that, in the Cape, I'd far rather be climbing mountains or surfing or drinking good wine than actually sitting there dealing with a crisis. So, you've got to use them for something. And it is about everything that Mohammed said. But we're very much a culture-driven organization.
All right.
Very much around people.
Okay.
And very much a purpose, have a greater purpose. So, for us, it is about, you spoke about team, and to us to develop that team and have world-class teams. And no coincidence, I'm talking about that tomorrow. And in hindsight, you realize it is about having a good team. Okay. And Man United are giving us a brilliant example at the moment.
Wow, Andrew.
What
You
can
had
I
to
say?
do that.
It's about trust. You actually have to trust each other. You have to trust yourself. You have to trust your players. So don't try and make the goalie, the striker, or the physio, or whatever. You've got to trust your players in their position and let them actually go and do what they have to do. And that's become very much part of our culture. So building that trust is really how you build a culture of belief and a culture of letting people do what they need to do. You referenced communication.
Yeah.
And communication's, that sort of...
The big C word.
The package word out there. What does it really mean?
Yeah.
So we turned it into something very tangible. It was a daily stand-up meeting.
Okay.
20 minutes every morning. Didn't matter where you were, phone in, be there. Doesn't matter. Be
Okay.
there. 20 minutes. Just people want to know.
Okay.
People want to know what's going on.
Yeah.
And in a crisis, things do change very quickly. So you actually need to just keep people informed. That's really all that people want. So building the communication cycle and understanding communication is about sharing. It's about listening. It's all of those things. And plan. You spoke about simple. Have a game plan. Sport again, bringing it in. Your plan is your game plan.
Okay.
Your communication is your scoreboard. You need to know how much time is left. You need to know what the score is. So all of these things are very important in building the culture that you can actually then go forward, and your purpose ultimately is why you are doing things. And I think a lot of people lose sight of having the longer term picture. We're not here today to do what we're doing. We're actually here for the long term.
Yeah.
If we're great businesses and we're running great businesses, we've got to be here for the long term.
Yeah.
So don't ever forget that greater
Longevity.
purpose that we're there for. And it's there actually to develop communities, develop our people, and do more than just do
Sell
what
the
we're doing.
bev.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got to use it, I think, to develop culture, quite honestly.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Dumisani, condolences to your department as well.
Yeah.
You did speak about the passing of your minister. You also touched on a very important thing about creating an opportunity out of a crisis. And in that you spoke about accountability, where if the guy at the top is camping outside of where the answer is, it then says to the team that we're all a part of this. And the message you're communicating there is that you're responsible. In that, how have you managed to make your teams buy into your strategy as the CFO so that you are speaking one cohesive language?
Okay. It was interesting. I was traveling with one of the colleagues who was actually in the room when we went to National Treasury, and he was saying to me, CFO, we were going to wait. I didn't realize that, your approach to say, the answer will never come. Because National Treasurer was keep on saying, the answer is coming, the letter is coming. I said, the letter will never come.
Right.
We need to go and fetch the letter.
Yes.
So what she was indicating to me says, it gave me an approach to a crisis that sometimes to wait and think that things will happen, they will never happen. I must make things happen. And I'm telling you, the reason why we got the letter on that specific day
It's
is
'cause you were
because we
there.
said we're not living without a letter.
Yes.
So that sent a message that people need to stop what they're doing in order to do that. But as a strategy going forward, one of the things I think that I have learned, and I think the team have learned, is how do you then deal with these things going forward? For me, it was critical. I wouldn't have anticipated this because I was just 4 months into the organization. But what we've learned from it is, one, we are doing forecast and saying, how do we prevent ourselves from overspending so that because we're lucky this time that some of it included non-cash items. It could possibly well include all cash items, the real expenditure. Then we would have actually had an irregular expenditure. So we do more forecast. We're helping each business unit to understand at their current run rate where they're going to end up. And I tell you, each and every executive, they understand very well. Business units that are likely to overspend, we're saying perhaps we need to beef up their movement. But not only that, if we are going to overspend overall, we need to get the minister's approval in advance before the end of the year. Because by the time Auditor General hit our ground, we need to make sure that we comply. Not only that, one of the things that it also taught us is that, what about irregular expenditure on the procurement side? And we started digging. And I'm telling you, that digging, it helped us to be more proactive so that if we discover there's any kind of irregular expenditure on the SCM system, then we start a condonation process. We start asking questions, when did it started? Because some of it, you can see it in the current financial year, but it started a couple of financial years there. And in terms of PFMA is that you declare and disclose on the year on which you discover it.
Okay.
So it has helped us to self-inspect.
Okay.
So that by the time the Auditor General comes, they're not the only one who's telling us what's wrong within our
Right.
system, but we're able to know.
Okay.
Not only that, we also went further and says, perhaps maybe we need to develop irregular expenditure guidelines, and more specifically to our environment, because there's certain things that we deal with, like darting of animals, which other organizations don't deal with, like the inventory stock of ammunition. And people, they like to say there's only one service provider there because of our unique environment. But you know what? They just want to cheapen the system.
Oh.
So that all of those things have actually helped us. But not only that, we've also coordinated our regular expenditure so that we report per department. So each and every executive that reports to the CEO, he knows exactly what deviation did I have, What kind of irregular expenditure have incurred in the last 2 years? In fact, we went further to say, let's compare the 2 years.
Okay.
Have you gone up in terms of deviation and irregular expenditure, or are you going down? And that helped people to understand the kind of environment and what's happening with their transaction. But I didn't only end there. I went to the CEO and said, you need to incentivize this executive by putting a specific KPI that if they reduce irregular expenditure, they
Okay.
reduce deviation.
Yeah.
Then it provides, if it hits them in their pocket,
Yeah.
then there's a really drive for them to act on it. Otherwise,
Okay.
executives, they worry about things that they believe are more important than the other things.
Okay.
So as a way of strategy going forward, it's really opened our eyes to a whole range of things.
Thanks for that. Thank you very much to my panelists.